I'm not entirely sure what information or what steps I'm going to have to edit out of here or edit out for the video just to keep it, short and concise. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more of the tech side of how I did the prep work and so on and so forth, again, not knowing what is going to have to be edited out, over on my website, I'll have a pretty lengthy write-up really going through all the nuts and bolts and all the steps of everything that I did. So if you're looking for that extra little bit of information, check it out over there. It's boatworkstoday.com. Now with that part done, the next thing we're going to do before we start sanding the glass on here is specifically on the epoxy samples, I'm going to go over with some warm water and just a Scotch-Brite pad just to remove any possible amine blush. Real simple to do. Warm water, Scotch-Brite pad. I'm just going to go over the surface, scrub it up, and then wipe it off with some paper towel. Now before we go ahead and start laying up our gel coat, we need to sand these surfaces down to kind of create that mechanical tooth for the gel coat to kind of hold on to. And for doing that, I'm going to be using my sander just to make things go a little quicker and some 80 grit sandpaper. Now as always, because we're going to be sanding glass, we've got to put our happy mask on. Well, we're finally at a point where we can start laying up our gel coat. I've gotten all the panels sanded and wiped down with acetone, so they're clean and ready to go. Now the gel coat we're going to be using is just a standard bright white laminating gel coat. It's just a general purpose gel coat. It's the same stuff I've used for years and years. So we're going to be mixing up 4 ounces of this. I'm going to be catalyzing this at about 1.5%. So for 4 ounces, I'm going to be throwing in roughly 2 cc's of MEC. And when I'm stirring this gel coat, just to make sure that the MEC is well incorporated, this gel coat's well mixed, scraping the side, just like we did with the epoxy and well, any other resin. Anytime you're mixing something, scrape the sides, scrape the bottoms, mix it up. I'm probably going to stir this for about a minute or so. Well, it's been about 4 days since we laid the gel coat up on top of the epoxy samples, and everything should be completely cured now. I keep it about 65, 68 in the shop here. So everything should be done. Everything should be done cooking. Now the first test that I wanted to look at here was going to be the flexing test. And for that we're going to be using these 3 pieces right here. If we look over these, we had three strips, each laid up with each of the hardeners. So we had a 205 sample, a 206 sample, and then finally the 207. Now what I'm looking for here is to see if the gel coat is going to kind of debond or break away from the epoxy glass that's beneath it when it's under stress. I'm going to go ahead and flex these, and ultimately I'm going to break them just because I want to. But that's not going to be through any fault of the gel coat being on top of the epoxy. That's just going to be the nature of the glass itself being stressed too far. But I like breaking stuff, so why not have a little bit of fun, right? All right, so the first piece we're going to try is going to be West System Epoxy mixed up with our 205 hardener. All right, you can hear some cracking here, but again, your boat will never have this much stress on it. This is expected to happen. All right. Gel coat edges are sticking up where the glass itself cracked, but nothing is breaking away. It's still well bonded with the epoxy beneath it. So, okay, now we're going to try the same thing with the 206 piece. Boy, this is some strong stuff. All right. Now, what do we have here? The gel coat sticking up. However, it's not flaking off. It's still well bonded to the epoxy beneath it. And the last sample is going to be the 207. Now that we have a clean break on this piece, right through here, you can see the little jagged edges of the gel coat kind of popping up. But it hasn't let go. So it's still very strongly bonded to the epoxy beneath it. Of these 3 samples, in my opinion, every single one of them passed with flying colors. Now, that was only one of our tests. So now let's go on to the second test. And that is going to be the fine edge bonding, I guess. So I'm going to take one edge of this on each of these samples, one edge of the gel coat, sand it down to a very fine taper, just like you'd be blending in a gel coat repair. And when we get to that point, then I'm going to be curious to see if the edge of the gel coat is still going to bond with the epoxy that's beneath it when it's that thin, or if that fine edge is just going to slowly kind of work itself back. But let's find out. We'll see. And here's a sample of the West System laid up using their 205 hardener. Nothing's lifted, and it is down to a very fine taper, to the point where it's so thin. I'm not sure if the camera is picking this up, but the fine lip of this is so thin that you can see through it. So that's pretty impressive. You know, and here's some powder. This is basically powder from me scratching. Nothing's lifting up. I can't even get underneath it. And the last sample, their 207 hardener. Well, it's the same as all the others. So here's our final test, and honestly, this is the one that I've been most interested to see kind of how it goes. Again, we've got my 3 samples here, each laid up with the hardeners, each of the hardeners from West System. Now the first sample I'm going to start with is going to be using the pieces laid up using their 205 hardener. And again, just to show everybody, this was the side that was laid up using 205 epoxy. This was the side that was laid up using laminated poly resin. So let's see what happens here. Okay, on the 205 piece, it did bond better with the poly side. However, the epoxy side did take some gel coat with it. So I don't know. I still think that has some promise. I mean, there was a good amount of force, used to pull these apart. So that's the results with the poly and the 205. Now let's see what happens with the 206 and the poly piece. Well, this just does not want to come apart. See if I can pull these apart by hand. Good God. Come on. Oh. Oh. Well, that was pretty interesting. This was the side laid up using the 206. This is the side laid up with the poly. Now the side that had the epoxy, which in theory, at least according to traditional school of thought, is a side that should have completely let go. However, it actually bonded stronger than the poly, and it pulled the glass right off of the wood on this poly sample. All the gel coat is still intact on the epoxy side, and it actually, like I said, it pulled the glass off of the plywood. I mean, that's, so using a 206 hardener, I think that was the winner on this tug of war. I think the 205 didn't quite fare as well, but the 206 definitely won that round. So, our last sample. This was the 207 in the poly. Oh, you're going to make me pull this apart again, aren't you? Here, ow. 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 All right, there's got to be a better way to try this. But it's my last piece, so get my fingers in there. All right, ready? And actually, there again, surprising. The 207 piece kept all of the gel coat and actually pulled the glass apart from the poly sample. There was really no gel coat that came off of this epoxy side. Interesting, very, very interesting. Well, at least according to this, the 206 and the 207 were clear winners here on this tug of war. So what exactly does all this mean? Well, for me personally, I can say that I am a lot more comfortable with the idea of actually using gel coat over top of epoxy. Up until this point, it's always been something that, you know, I've done in a pinch on small areas, but you can just kind of kept my fingers crossed, not really knowing, you know, what exactly is what was gonna come of it. But having seen this, much more comfortable with this. Now, one thing I want to mention, for the sake of transparency, because I know that there are going to be people that kind of post by the hip comments saying, well, that I was getting paid by West System and this was a publicity stunt or something to do to benefit them. No, absolutely not. I got nothing from West System. I got no compensation, nothing. They were aware that I was going to do this test, but they had absolutely no say in how I tested it or what I tested. They were hands off. And I brought the idea up to them and they said, go for it. You know, they specifically said, don't copy what we've already tested. Do something different. You lay out the parameters, you lay out the tests. It's 100% up to you how you want to do it. You know, just, you know, let us know how it goes. And to me, at least, that, you know, that speaks pretty loud to their confidence in their product. I don't know that I could get a hold of any other epoxy manufacturer and they would be quite so willing. Now, given that, am I going to recommend, you know, say, you know, go out and do epoxy or do a gel coat over top of your epoxy? I'm going to leave that one up to you. Like I said, for me personally, I'm much more comfortable with the idea. Whether you choose to do it or not is up to you. One thing I will stress is if you decide to go this route, and it's not necessarily something that's specific to using a poly over epoxy. This is a general rule for any type of composite work. Make sure your surface is fully cured and make sure it's cleaned and prepped properly. Whenever you're using epoxy, you know, looking at this example specifically, you have to deal with what's called amine blush. I'm going to call it amine blush just because I've never heard anybody say it, and well, I'm going to call it amine blush. So whenever you're working with epoxy, that's just something you need to deal with. It's a byproduct of the curing process, And it's a very simple thing to do. You saw me do it on the videos. Basically, it's removing it with some water, warm water, and a Scotch-Brite pad. Going over it, wiping it off with a clean paper towel, and you've removed the blush. That blush is one of the things that can possibly prevent the gel coat from bonding. The same applies to whether if you're working with a poly sample, polyester-based sample, or a vinyl ester. You have to put something over the top to cure the surface. If it's a wax or if it's any kind of additive, you still want to remove that top surface so that you're getting down to the meat or the heart of that resin. So the prep work isn't anything specific to epoxy. It's a general rule. So I think that's about it. I'm going to wrap this up. Now, I do still have these test samples over here. I had mentioned that there might be the possibility of me driving these over to the West System headquarters for them to hook up their machines and actually get some numeric values on this, on the shearing strengths. I still don't know if I'm going to be able to drive them there, or if I'm just going to have to mail them. We're about a little over a week away from Christmas, and there's just, well, Christmas. So there's a lot going on, a lot of last minute things to get buttoned up to get ready for Santa. So that one is going to be a little bit up in the air. Anyways, have a good night, have a safe holidays, and we'll see you next year.
This has been a Boatworks Today production.